Hello, I would like to welcome you to this presentation on ticks and tick-borne diseases. My name is Laura Hunt, and I am the program coordinator at the Madison Senior Center. This presentation is put on by the Madison Senior Center and the Monona Terrace. The Senior Center is committed to healthy aging opportunities for all older adults in the Madison community. The sponsor of today's program is UW-Madison's All of Us research program. All of Us is working to make medical research reflective of all people, including BIPOC and older adults. Please stop by their table after the presentation to learn more. Today, we welcome Dr. Xia Lee, who is a public health entomologist and an expert on ticks and tick-borne diseases in Wisconsin. He has a master's and PhD in entomology from UW-Madison, where he directs and manages projects to investigate the effectiveness of host-targeted interventions, mowing, and acaricides in reducing ticks and the prevalence of the Lyme disease agent in host-seeking ticks. Dr. Lee works for the Upper Midwestern Center of Excellence for Vector-Borne Disease at the UW-Madison. He is interested in the host-seeking behavior of the black-legged tick and has collaborated with other institutions to investigate two newly emerging disease pathogens. At the end of Dr. Lee's presentation, we will offer Q&A. Webinar attendees can participate by clicking the Q&A icon on your screen and typing in the text box that appears. Please feel free to type in your questions anytime during the presentation. Following this presentation, a copy of this webinar and any handouts will be posted on the Wellness Talks page of Monona Terrace's website. A survey will be distributed within a week of the program. Your feedback is important to us. Thank you. Welcome.
All right, thank you, Laura. So today I'm gonna, as Laura mentioned, I'm gonna talk about ticks and tick-borne diseases in Wisconsin. And when we think about burden of disease in Wisconsin, this is sort of what we see. There's, if you look at this pie chart, these are the pathogens or the diseases that are transmitted by vectors in Wisconsin. And if we were to take this pie chart and we were to split it on the diseases, this is sort of what it looks like. A majority of diseases that are transmitted in Wisconsin are caused by a tick. And the majority of those, about 70% of those diseases that are reported are Lyme disease. And then the other 22%, another 22% is Anaplasmosis, which is also another tick-borne disease. And then you have a whole wide spectrum of other pathogens that are transmitted by vectors in Wisconsin. So if we break this down, it turns out that a lot of the pathogens that are transmitted in Wisconsin by vectors or insects or arthropods are transmitted by ticks. And there's a small proportion that are transmitted by mosquitoes. So in this case, we have about 4%, 2% of which are acquired locally, and then the other 2% are can be related to travel related issues. In Wisconsin, we have about, I'd say about 16 different tick species. This does change depending on how you interpret some of these ticks in terms of their level of establishment here in Wisconsin. But in general, we only are concerned about 3 species out of these 16, and that's Ixodes scapularis, the black-legged tick, Dermcenter variabilis, the woodtick, and then Amblyomma americanum, the Lone Star tick. The other 13 species on this list tend to be very host-specific, so you won't be able to find them unless you are looking at the host. So for example, we have Ixodes texanus here, which feeds primarily on small carnivores like raccoons. So if you were to find a raccoon on the side of the road that's injured or dead and you look through it, you pull off ticks, you'll most likely find Ixodes texanus. So these are the 3 species that we are concerned about. So we got the black-legged tick on top, the woodtick in the middle, and then the Lone Star tick at the bottom. And so I'll talk a little bit about each of these and what their, what our concerns are in terms of their capability for transmission of disease in Wisconsin. And we'll start off the Lone Star tick, because this is important in terms of the diseases that it can transmit. But in general, in Wisconsin, we really aren't too concerned about it. So this tick is very common in the southern part of the United States. It's very easily identifiable because this is the female, and it's got this nice little white spot on it, hence the name, the Lone Star. And then these are the males. They aren't as beautiful as the females in terms of, that nice white coloration, but you can't really see right here, but at the back, they have what are called festoons. And if you were to see one of these in real life, they've got really nice white pearl molding coloration at the back. It's really easy to spot, really easy to see. Ever since 2008, when we first got our first report of the Lone Star tick, the numbers have been increasing throughout Wisconsin, but I'll show you in a second that there's really no pattern to that. And like I mentioned before, we're really not too concerned about this tick in Wisconsin because they're very uncommonly encountered. Maybe throughout the summer, we'll get maybe 5 or 10 reports of this tick throughout Wisconsin. And so this is a publication from several years ago, 2016, where we looked at the overall submissions of the Lone Star tick throughout Wisconsin. And these are from the general public, from veterinarians, and from ourselves doing tick sampling out there. And as you can see that there really is no clear pattern to where the ticks are. This tick, like I mentioned before, is commonly found in the southern parts of the United States. And so if we think that this is an invasion, we would see more ticks on the southern part because they're coming in from Illinois or maybe from Iowa. But that's not the case. We see a lot here in Dane County because we live here in Dane County, we do our work here in Dane County. And so it's easier for us to find more ticks in that case because of the increased efforts or surveillance effort. But as you can see, we have reports from the northern parts of Wisconsin, from the northeastern parts of Wisconsin, from the eastern parts of Wisconsin, so no clear pattern. So we think that their migration or their movement into Wisconsin could be because of travel, individuals going out of state, bringing ticks back, ticks are falling off of their pets or off of them into the natural habitat. Or it could be based on migratory birds moving in from the southern parts of the United States. In terms of its significance, though, it does transmit a number of pathogens, but the one that we do hear, or the question that we do get the most, is whether or not it causes a red meat allergy. And there recently was an article about this. And if you get bitten, you can develop a red meat allergy. I'm not 100% sure what the percentage or what the chances are of that happening. But this is an immune response to a protein or a carbohydrate called the alpha-gal carbohydrate, which is found in tick saliva. So when the tick bites you, it injects you with saliva, and in that saliva is a concoction of a number of things, including this alpha-gal carbohydrate. And it turns out that this is also found in red meat as well. So when the tick bites you, your body builds a immune response to whatever's in the salivary gland, including alpha-gal. When you eat red meat, your body thinks you're being attacked by a tick, and so it mounts an immune response to that. So like I said, in red meat, such as beef, pork, lamb, and milk, but you are still fine to eat fish, reptiles if you're if you're willing, birds as well. And of course, this is not permanent. It does go away after a while, 2 or 3 years. The next tick I want to talk about is the wood tick. And so this is the one that's most commonly encountered. I get about, in a typical year, I probably get a lot of submissions of the wood tick from the general public. They do think that this might be a deer tick, but this is a wood tick, and you can always tell because they have this really dark brown coloration with this white molding on the back. That's called the scutum. The males tend to be a little bit more colorful. They have, you can't really tell, you can't see very well here, but they have this really nice white pearl molding along the back. In terms of disease transmission, these ticks can transmit a pathogen called Rocky Mountain spotted fever. It's very uncommon here in Wisconsin. So we think of these ticks more of a nuisance or pest. You go out into the the park or into the wood, and you come across a tick. It's most likely this tick. It bites you. It's easy to pull off, and it's more or less a nuisance. But like I said, it can transmit a pathogen called Rocky Mountain spotted fever, or something similar to that in the Rocky Mountain, or the spotty rickettsia group. So Rocky Mountain spotted fever usually causes acute febrile illness in terms of its symptoms. And this is something that you'll see as we go through a lot of the tick-borne pathogens, that they share very similar symptoms. And as I mentioned before, and as I just mentioned, that the symptoms are, they aren't specific. I will show you something else that is very specific to Rocky Mountain spotted fever. But as we go through this, you'll see that a lot of these tick-borne pathogens share very similar symptoms. Risk factors for developing severe symptoms of Rocky Mountain spotted fever include age. We also see a lot of mortality in younger individuals in the population, those that are immune compromised, or individuals with G6PD deficiency. And so here are some symptoms, some early symptoms. These are the acute febrile illnesses, such as fever, chills, severe headache, malaise, body aches, and then general GI symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and anorexia. If not caught or treated early, it can cause a wide variety of symptoms, such as damage to your blood vessels, which can lead to amputation of arms or legs to save you, hearing loss, paralysis, and then mental disability. So for Rocky Mountain spotted fever, this is usually the symptom that we watch for. And so this is the typical rash that we see in Lyme disease. We see the typical bullseye rash. In Rocky Mountain spotted fever, we see this sort of pinpoint rash. And this does develop pretty quickly within 2 to 4 days. But the thing to know here is that sometimes it doesn't develop. Sometimes you can get Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and then 10% of cases, you don't see this sort of tell symptom. In Wisconsin, we see about, we don't see that many, like I said, in terms of of these cases. So here in 2019 or 2020, we see about 5 to 10 cases. And the unfortunate thing here is that we can't differentiate between Rocky Mountain spotted fever and the other pathogens or diseases within the spotted fever group. And so this could be Rocky Mountain spotted fever, or it could be something else that's related to Rocky Mountain spotted fever that is more milder in terms of the symptoms that you do develop once infected. In terms of its range for Rocky Mountain spotted fever, we generally see that a lot of the states with the higher incidence of Rocky Mountain spotted fever are within that little sort of central area. So Arkansas, Missouri, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. And so here we are in Wisconsin, and sort of within the surrounding area, we generally don't see a lot of cases of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And so, because of that, we usually think of the wood tick as more of a nuisance tick than a vector of pathogens. Although you should be cognizant of the fact that if you get bitten by one, you should still watch out for signs and symptoms of illness or infection. All right, so now we can get sort of into the meat of the presentation here once we've gone through all those, the other two species. And so this is the black-legged tick. And these are the pathogens that it transmits, or the diseases that it transmits. So we have Lyme disease, again, being the majority of the diseases that are recorded or reported here in Wisconsin and to CDC. And then we have a variety of other pathogens or diseases such as tick-borne relapsing fever. We have anaplasmosis, as mentioned before, which is 22% of the cases that are reported to Department of Health Services here on an annual basis. Then we have babesiosis, ehrlichiosis, and then finally Powassan virus or Powassan disease. So the black-legged tick has 4 life stages, 3 of which are active. So the larva, the nymphal, and the adult tick. And if you look at the black-legged tick, and these are the life stages over here, you can see that we have the larva here, the nymph here, and we have the adult here. You can see that the adults are sexually dimorphic. And much like the Lone Star tick and the wood tick, where you have differences in differences between female and males, you also see the same thing for the black-legged tick. The females have this really nice orange or red-orange aloscutum, and then they have this really drab-brown scutum. The males are just very drab-brown, very boring, kind of like how males are, kind of boring as well. And then also note that we have the nymphal ticks, which are very similar in terms of their looks to the females, except for they're much smaller, and they don't have that red scutum. In terms of the distribution of this tick can be found in the Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, and it can also be found in the Northeast and southern parts of the United States. One general question we always get when we talk about ticks is, where can you get ticks? And there's a lot of misunderstanding on that. People will go into the woods, get a tick, and tell us that it's a black-legged tick, but most of the time it's not. Or they'll go into the park, get a tick, and they'll tell us that it's a black-legged tick. And again, most of the time it's not. About 50% of the time, it's usually not a black-legged tick. And black-legged tick, although they are if you try to kill or crush a tick in your hand, it can be pretty difficult. But it turns out they're pretty weak in the environment. They are pretty susceptible to environmental conditions, especially to desiccation. And so in an area like this, where it's really wide, open, sunny, this is not an area where you would find a black-legged tick. You may find one here or there as a stray, but for the most part, they're not going to be able to live in this sort of environment for a long period of time. So when we think of something like this, when you look at this open road with a lot of sunlight coming through, this is usually where we find wood ticks and Lone Star ticks if they're out there. And I've been on roads like this, look down and then just see a swarm of wood ticks crawling at me, trying to attack me. If you've ever been down a country road and there's grass or vegetation in the middle of the road and you're plowing through it with your car, yeah, that's usually where you'll find the wood ticks as well. And it's interesting because we'll get in a car, we'll drive down these country roads, and this is just fresh from UW into the car, into the country road, run through all this vegetation, and then 30 minutes later, there's something crawling on our necks, How the wood tick gets from that onto the car, inside the car, and onto us, huge mystery, but it can happen. But in terms of concerns or habitats that are suitable for black-legged tick, this is sort of the environment. This is the ideal condition environment here: forested, shaded, and moist. So if you were out here hiking, there would be ticks here on the side of the trail, on the vegetation, and there's definitely ticks on this trail as well. Interestingly, although we do find a lot of black-legged ticks here, we also don't find a lot of wood ticks or Lone Star ticks in this environment. We do find them occasionally, very much like in that open space where we will find the stray black-legged tick. Here we will find the stray wood tick or Lone Star tick. We're not quite sure why that is. I mean, they can thrive in these environments. It's just maybe there's over competition, or maybe there's something else that we're not aware of. But generally, when we think of habitat that's suitable for black-legged ticks or dare ticks, forested, shaded, and moist. All right, so a little bit more on the biology of ticks. And so ticks exhibit this behavior called questing. And this is the behavior that they use when they are host seeking. And so ticks, in this particular example, black-legged tick will climb up on vegetation. It'll take its little forelegs, it'll wave it around, and on those forelegs are little sensory organs to sense movement, to sense CO2, and to sense heat, we think. And so when you come by, or when you are within the proximity of the tick, it will get itself ready. And when you come by, it will grab onto you or grab onto any other hosts or animals that might be walking by, so it can feed on them. More important misconception: ticks don't fall from trees. Like I mentioned here, ticks quest. They come from the bottom of the vegetation. They climb up to the top and they wait there patiently. And when they are dry, or when they start to feel dry, then they'll move back down to the vegetation to rehydrate before they come back up again. So because of this, ticks don't fall from trees. And something else to think about: if you're a tick, tiny like that, and you're falling from a tree, even a gentle breeze will knock you 50 feet in the wrong direction. So as a predator, that's probably a terrible strategy, to drop from a tree to try to hit your target, and and then get knocked off course by the gentlest of breeze. So ticks don't fall from trees. They move from the bottom of the vegetation up to the top. And that height also matters depending on the life stage. So adults, we generally say, can move up to about 4 or 5 feet and quest at that level. Nymphal ticks tend to be lower towards your ankle or your foot. And we'll talk about those in a bit. So this is a life cycle of the blacklight tick. It's very complicated. It's very noisy. What you need to know is that ticks generally live for about 2 or 3 years, depending on your view of it. But in general, the eggs will hatch down here. The females will lay eggs. The eggs will hatch into these larval ticks. The larva will feed on a host. And this is important because this is where the tick can pick up a pathogen. Ticks are generally born pathogen free. And so, yesterday I was out there in the woods doing tick collections as I normally do. And I got bit I came home and I found one of these on myself. And I was like, oh, cool. This is my opportunity to take pictures because this almost never happens. And I wasn't too concerned about pathogens because, like I said, ticks are almost never born with a pathogen. So like, yeah, there's a risk, that I might get something, but the risk is very low. And I don't have any pictures of these guys feed on humans because it almost never happens, but they can. And so when they feed on on a host, this is the opportunity to pick up a pathogen. And once they feed, they'll go and overwinter and then molt into the nymphal stage. And then the nymphal stage will also feed. And this is also another opportunity to pick up a pathogen as well. Then once they feed successfully, they'll molt into the adult stage. And then now the adult stage can start to quest and look for hosts. And so, keep in mind that at this point, they've fed twice. They've had 2 opportunities to pick up a pathogen. So when we think about these life stages and these opportunities to pick up pathogens and the ability to transmit that pathogen to humans, we generally say that the nymphs are the most important in terms of disease transmission. So the adults are pretty big, nicely colored, almost as if they want us to see them and spot them on us. But the nymphs are very drab colored. They're really dull. You can see that the back part of this nymph is sort of light color. The front part is brown. It looks like a mole or a freckle on us. So it's very hard to detect. And because of that, we believe that they are the most important for disease transmission. And as I mentioned before, at this point, they would have already taken 1 blood meal and would have had the opportunity to pick up a pathogen. And so now they can transmit that pathogen. And this is also a fun little picture. This is a muffin. We always compare the size of a nymphal tick to that of a sesame seed. And so somewhere on this muffin, there are some ticks. I'll give a couple seconds to see if you guys can spot them. I'm seeing some head shakes over there. You got them all? Here's a close-up. And here they are. Did you guys get them all? People generally don't like this comparison because then it ruins muffins for them. But something else to consider is that the tick seasonal patterns, or when they're out there looking for a host, varies as well. And so something to consider is that when you're out there, so here we have time or months on the x-axis, and then we have in general number of ticks up here. If we look at the adult ticks, this is, about a month ago would be, what we would consider the peak questing time for the adult ticks. So if we were out there looking for ticks, that's when we would find the most. And then once they're done, so around this time is usually when we see them sort of take a nosedive, and then we don't see them again for the rest of the summer until late fall. Now, nymphal ticks, like I mentioned, the ones that are that we think are responsible for transmitting disease, they show up around this time when it's warm, when you and I are out there playing in the woods. And they come out around this time, they stay until late July, and then they disappear for the rest of the summer. You can still find them later on in the summer, but the numbers are much lower, maybe 1 here or there. But for the most part, if you're going to find, if you're looking for nymphal ticks, this is the part of the season where you will most likely find them. And then finally, larval ticks, just to sort of throw them into the group here. They also show up at the same time as the nymphal ticks, and then they do have a second peak later on in August, but we're not usually concerned about them because, like I said, they don't. They're usually born without a pathogen or pathogen free. And so CDC has this really cool tick bite tracker. If you go here, and unfortunately, you can't filter it down to the state, but these are the number of emergency room visits, or sorry, tick bite emergency room visits that were reported throughout the Midwest. And you can see this is 22, that we're sort of a little bit above average. And you can see that, like I mentioned, June, when the nymphal ticks are out there biting people, this is sort of also when we see that sort of spike in the number of reported emergency room visits as well. And of course, when we talk about, ticks and when they're out there biting people, we always get the question of, well, what about winter? Do ticks die during winter? Do they go away and just not come back? And what do we do? And based on what we know, ticks can be active during the wintertime. So if you take this example here of this woods here, you can see that there's no snow cover up on the forest floor here. And so this is one of the conditions that has to be met. If there is snow cover, ticks generally tend to not get through that snow. But when there's no snow cover, the ticks can easily climb out from underneath the vegetation or the leaf litter and feed on you. And so this is an example of, of a date in early April where we had a sort of an above average day. And so here is April 9th. You can see that the temperatures are about 35 at around noon and sort of dropping a little bit. And then around 3 p.m. the next day on Saturday, temperature sort of went towards 40 degrees. And then if we were to take a look at the temperature a couple of days past that Saturday here on Wednesday or Tuesday and Wednesday, you can see that we have pretty good temperature around the mid 50s or so. And so our general rule of thumb is that when the temperature is above 40 degrees, that's when ticks are usually active. And this is adult ticks. And so here, for this day, for this Saturday, we have a small period or a small window here when ticks could be active. But on this Tuesday and Wednesday, we're way above that threshold, the activity threshold. So if you're out in the woods during this time, even if there's still snow out there, as long as the temperature is above 40 degrees, that's when we see ticks active. And this is usually when we get reports of tick bites, from around Wisconsin. All right, so a little history lesson here. Ticks have been in Wisconsin for a while, but due to a number of reasons, especially overhunting of deer and deforestation, tick populations sort of got pushed almost out of Wisconsin. And it wasn't until 1965 when we had the first reported tick bite in a forest worker in Lincoln County. Funny thing, we've gone through the records and ticks have been here in Wisconsin for way longer than this. It's just that this is the first official reported tick bite that we know of, but we do have ticks in record from way before this time. And like I mentioned before, we believe that this is because of things such as deforestation and overhunting of deer, which force deer all the way up to the northern parts of Wisconsin. And deer are very important hosts for ticks. In experiments where they've removed deer from the environment, tick populations have declined. But the good thing is that ticks aren't good reservoirs for the pathogens. They're just good hosts for the adult ticks. So when we talk about deer and their contribution to the tick, to the tick life cycle, we sort of think of deer as sort of like the nightclubs of the tick world, where the males and the females can go hang out and reproduce. And so if you remove the nightclub from the system, the populations crash. And so that's what we think happened here when overhunting forced deer into the northern parts of Wisconsin, northwestern parts of Wisconsin, and deforestation as well. And so, interestingly, if you look at this map here that shows where deer populations are commonly encountered during the early in 1965, no, not 1965, in the early 1900s. And so if you look at this, you can see that, that sort of matches, where we found the first tick in 1965, sort of matches that range expansion, or not the expansion, but the range of the white-tailed deer at that time. And if we look at some of the work that has been done over the last decade or so, and in this case, this is an example of a deer survey that was done by Department of Health Services, where they went out, they looked at deers that were killed by hunters, and then they checked them for ticks. And so if we look at this, we can sort of see here on this west side, you don't have to worry about the percentage of deer infested or what the pie chart means. Just know that based on this research, we showed that a large number of deer that were harvested in the western and northern parts of Wisconsin were infested with deer, or sorry, not deer, ticks. And if you look at the eastern part of Wisconsin, we didn't see much there in terms of infestation on deer. And if we move through time and look at the other surveys that were conducted, you can see that the tick population started to shift. We started to see ticks here in the southern parts of Wisconsin in the 1989 survey. And if we move into 1994, we could see that there's now ticks infesting deer in the central part of Wisconsin. And if we look at the last survey that was done in 2013, we can see that now the eastern part of Wisconsin also has deer that are infested with ticks. And if we look at sort of the right now sort of snapshot of right now, we could see that ticks are pretty much found in every county in Wisconsin. They are found in Winnebago County as well, except for we don't have what you would call an established population or a breeding population based on CDC guidelines. We have found them, but like I said, it's not a breeding or established population. So if you want to go camping or hiking, Winnebago County is probably the place to go if you want to avoid black-legged ticks. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the tick-borne diseases that are transmitted by this tick right here, the black-legged tick. And so those are Lyme disease, Anaplasmosis, ehrlichiosis, babesiosis, Barilla Miyamotoi disease, and then Powassan virus. I won't talk too much about Miyamotoi. I think this is probably the only thing I'll say about it. It's sort of uncommon as well. And so in terms of tick-borne pathogens in Wisconsin, this is sort of our timeline in terms of when they started to show up. 1968 was the first reported case of Lyme disease in the United States, in fact, and that was here in Wisconsin. And so, the traditional or the classic Lyme disease cases in Lyme, Connecticut wasn't reported until 1975. And that was way after the Lyme disease that was reported here in Wisconsin. And if you sort of look down the line here, babesiosis didn't really show up until 1983. Anaplasmosis or human granulocytic ehrlichiosis didn't show up until the early 1900s, or sorry, not 1900s, 1990s. And then in 2009 and 2013, we found two newly emergent diseases. So this one called Ehrlichia miris occlurensis, because it was isolated in individuals from the Eau Claire region, and then a new pathogen that causes Lyme disease, Borrelia mayonii. And all of these are in Wisconsin. And so a little bit about Lyme disease here. So this is the typical EM rash that you associate with Lyme disease. And this shows up in about 70 to 80% of individuals that are infected. So just because you got a tick bite, that's a black-legged tick bite, doesn't mean that you'll have these symptoms. You may have the other symptoms, but these don't, the typical EM rash might not show up. Other symptoms of Lyme disease are your typical, flu-like symptoms, your acute febrile illnesses. And these usually show up within a week to a month or so. So this is what we call the localized phase, when the infection is still fresh. And then, if you don't get it treated right away, these are sort of the symptoms that will show up at a later stage. So if not treated right away, after 1 to 3 months, you can develop multiple EM rashes. Facial palsy is also another symptom, meningitis, and then irregular heart rhythms as well. And of course, if not treated, you can develop long-term issues such as arthritis, cognitive impairment, and issues with your spinal. In terms of distribution and cases in the United States, Lyme disease is not only in Wisconsin. We see lots of cases in the northeastern part of Wisconsin. And if you keep in mind that map of the distribution of the black-legged tick throughout the United States, you'll also recognize that they are found down here in the southern parts of the United States, but the cases of Lyme disease are really low in the southern parts of the United States. And we think this is because of the behavior of the black-legged tick down here in the southern parts of the United States, that we may have two different, genetically different groupings of black-legged ticks, and then the ones down here prefer not to feed on humans, but rather on reptiles and other animals. In terms of cases in Wisconsin, this is a map of our latest cases from 2020. You can see that we have cases from throughout all of Wisconsin. What this doesn't show is that the burden of disease is usually much higher in the northern parts of Wisconsin compared to the southern parts of Wisconsin. But as you can see, we do have cases and potentially exposure throughout all of Wisconsin. In terms of cases over the years, in 1990, when it was first reported, we can see that the cases have increased ever since then. And interestingly enough, based on some of the work that CDC has done, we estimate that the number of cases of Lyme disease is probably underestimated by quite a bit. So this is the number of reported cases, and you can see that this is what they estimate is actually the real number of cases here. So cases are probably underestimated by tenfold in the United States. So instead of 38,000 cases, the actual number of cases is probably closer towards 300 to 400,000 cases on an annual basis. And this here is just to sort of show you again that we see a lot of cases being reported during that June and July month, during the months of June and July, which overlaps very well with the nymphal activity, the nymphs, the life stage that we are pretty sure are responsible for transmission of Lyme disease because they're smaller and harder to detect. And so with that in mind, I'm just going to go over briefly some symptoms of the other diseases. And as mentioned before, you'll see some very common themes here in terms of the symptoms that are that accompany infection of one of these pathogens. And so anaplasmosis is the first one here. Again, typical acute febrile illness. Most cases are mild and can be moderate to self-limiting, but we rarely see severe illness or death. Risk factor for developing severe symptoms are usually things such as old age, and then individuals that are immune compromised. And then, again, just to show you the acute febrile illness, such as fever, chills, severe headache, malaise, body aches, and GI symptoms. And then if not treated right away, then you can develop some late stage illness, such as renal or respiratory failure, blood clotting, and some hemorrhaging. Ehrlichiosis, which is very similar to anaplasmosis, again, acute febrile illness. Most cases, again, much like anaplasmosis, are mild to moderate, and then severe illness and death can occur. And then again, very much like anaplasmosis, risk factors are very similar, delayed treatment, age, and then immune compromise. And again, acute febrile illness such as fever, chills, headache, malaise, GI issues, are very common. And then if not treated right away, you do have some late stage symptoms such as blood clotting disorder, meningitis, acute respiratory distress syndrome. Babesiosis, this is a little bit different, but again, it has the same sort of symptoms of infection, that acute febrile illness that can be accompanied by anemia. And so for Babesia, cases again are very mild, but again, like anaplasmosis and ehrlichiosis, death can occur. Risk factors for developing severe disease of Babesia include, again, old age and immune compromised individuals. And then again, symptoms are very similar to what we've seen before with the other pathogens or other diseases. And so this is the last one. This is Powassan virus or Powassan disease. Again, you do have the acute febrile illness in terms of symptoms. These are usually mild or subclinical, meaning that if you are infected, you generally aren't symptomatic, but it can cause severe neuroinvasive illness and death. Risk factors, again, are old age and immune compromise. And again, acute febrile illness such as fever, chills, headache, fatigue, body aches, and GI issues are usually symptoms of infection. So as mentioned before, a lot of these pathogens cause very similar, disease or signs and symptoms of disease. So it's very hard, on the outside to decide or determine what disease you may be infected with. If you just show up at your physician saying, hey, look, I have fever, chills, and headache, it could be any of those pathogens. Fortunately, for treatment of tick-borne diseases, a lot of the pathogens, Lyme disease, anaplasmosis, ehrlichiosis, and the spotted fever group, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, can all be treated with the same treatment. Babesiosis and Boston virus are a little bit different. So with the bacterial diseases, you can treat that with doxy. Babesiosis, since it's a protozoan, requires a different set of treatment. And then Boston virus, unfortunately, we don't have a treatment for that. The only thing we can provide if you do end up with an infection is supportive care. All right, so I'm gonna finish this off with sort of the changing risk of tick-borne diseases or exposure here in Madison. And so when we think of risk in Madison and in Wisconsin in general, we sort of group them into three broad categories, such as exposure or risk at the forested level, the recreational level, and the residential level. So forested is usually what we consider for hunters or individuals who are game to go into the woods. Recreational, such as state parks, when you're walking on a trail like this, and then residential within your own backyard. And so this is a map of Madison, and I just want to point out the UW Arboretum down here. And so prior to 2010, when we used to do a lot of surveillance over there, we found in the usual straight black-leg tick here and there, but it wasn't until 2010 and 2011 when we saw an increase or surge in the number of black-legged ticks in this area. And based on what we get in terms of submissions from the public, in terms of images, letters and stories, we know that the tick can be found throughout all of Madison. It's just a question of where are they? Are they there in large numbers? And if if they have any of the pathogens that I have previously mentioned before. So with that in mind, in 2020 during COVID year, we went out and we sampled a lot of the city parks in Madison to see if we can sort of get at that question of where are the ticks in Madison. We know for sure that there are a couple areas where we can find the ticks, such as the UW Arboretum. There's a little park up here in, I think it's that one, yeah, called Sandburg Conservancy, where we know ticks are there as well. And so for this summer, we looked at 14 parks in Madison. And we went out there, we collected ticks, and what we found were that 7 of those 14 parks were infested with at least one tick. But what's not shown here is the number of ticks that we collect from these parks. As I mentioned, the UW Arboretum is a place where we can get lots of ticks. Sandburg up here is also another area where we can find a lot of ticks. But for these other locations, we found about 1 or 2 ticks. Not a lot of ticks, not a lot to suggest that there's a firm established population within those areas, but enough to let us know that the ticks are probably there. And this is important because this is something new to Madison that we haven't really thought about in other areas of Wisconsin, such as Eau Claire and over by the Dells, where we've done a lot of work. We know that there are ticks in people's backyard. Those individuals, those homeowners are well aware of that risk. But here in Madison, it might not be the case. Like I said, we do get reports from the public and submissions from the public of ticks to show that they are there. But do all of these homeowners know? Are they all aware of the risk that that could potentially be in these woods? And this is important because that risk, can happen to you at any point when you're out there in the backyard. So we get a lot of submissions of people who get ticks on them while they're out there mowing the grass. Or here's an image of another backyard with a lot of vegetation aside. If you have kids, what's also not shown here is that right past here is this big old, wooden structure where the kids were playing on. And if there are ticks here, they can be easily exposed to those ticks. And so the prevailing thought in Wisconsin now is that your risk is not just in forested areas as a hunter or in parks when you're out for a walk. But now we're starting to see this shift towards encountering ticks in your own backyard. And because of that, we always, finish these presentations with advocacy for bite prevention, such as using EPA registered repellents such as Deet, picaridin. And then EPA has this really nice website down here where you can go and look for repellents that may be that are useful for maybe you're interested in a repellent that lasts for a whole day. You can go here and you can search for that repellent, and you can go to the store and purchase those repellents. When you're out there going for a walk, make sure you wear appropriate clothes, long pants, wear long socks, tuck your pants into your socks, stay within trails. Like I mentioned before, you can find ticks on these sites pretty readily. You could probably find ticks here on this trail as well, but the chance of you coming into contact with a tick on the trail is much less compared to ticks on the side of the trail. So stay within that trail. And if you see signs to avoid areas because of ticks or to warn you about ticks, either avoid those areas or be cognizant of the fact that there are ticks in those areas. And if you do go into those areas, make sure you do tick checks promptly as soon as you come out of there. So how do you remove a tick? And we show this because there's a lot of misinformation on how to remove a tick. I've gotten stories about people trying to light them on fire. Bad idea. I have stories about putting Vaseline on the tick. Also a bad idea. The recommended strategy is to grab it by the mouth part and slowly pull it out. For wood ticks, because they have smaller mouth parts, it's really easy to yank them out of there. For blacklight ticks, it's a little bit of a struggle. So when the ticks bite you, they also secrete a sort of a little cement layer in there to sort of glue themselves in to prevent you from pulling them out. And their teeth are also oriented in a way that they're pointed backwards. So when they're in you, it's harder for you to remove them. And what I found is that when you try to grab them by the teeth and slowly pull them out, it's almost never worked for me. I mean, don't get me wrong, like the tick will come out, but the mouth parts are usually left inside of me. I have wounds on me from tick bites that still haven't healed from years because mouth parts have been left in me. So it is recommended that you grab them by the mouth part, slowly pull them out. One other thing that I found is this little tick tornado thing where you can take this device, stick it underneath the tick by the mouth parts, and you can rotate the tick out. I've actually found that works quite well. It's not recommended, but for me at least, it's worked quite well. But what you don't want to do is grab the tick by the body or do anything to shock the tick or scare the tick. So within the tick are the pathogens that it could potentially transmit to you. So the general rule of thumb is that it takes about 24 hours for the pathogen to migrate from the gut of the tick into the mouth parts and then be injected in you. And this is just for the pathogen that causes Lyme disease. It varies depending on pathogen. Powassan virus, for example, is about 15 minutes or less. But what you don't want to do is squeeze the tick on that abdomen or in this, in this area, because if you do that, then it could potentially flush everything out into you. And so instead of potentially being infected, you were almost sort of guarantee yourself an infection because now it's injecting everything into you, almost like a syringe. We do have a tick ID service. So if you're out there or someone else is out there and they get bitten, you can, you can just look up tick ID service, click on that, and you can submit an image of your tick, and we can ID that for you and give you some sort of helpful tips on what to do afterwards. And of course, we have the tick app that you can use to do the same thing, keep daily logs of your activity and potential exposure. And finally, CDC just launched this new thing called the Tick-Bot. And if you get a tick bite, you can go here, answer a bunch of questions. And once you're done with those questions, CDC can provide you with a general guideline of what to do next. So this is me going through it because I got a tick bite yesterday. And this is the tick that bit me yesterday, a small larval tick. And so like I mentioned before, because these guys are usually born infection-free, I wasn't a little concerned about this, but it can still bite you. So with that, I'll leave it for questions.
Are you
Am I concerned when adult ticks bite me? Yes, usually when I'm out in the woods doing my work, I will go do my work. And as soon as I move out of the forest, I'll check myself for ticks, pull any ticks that I have off of me. And then when I get home, I promptly check myself for ticks and pull them off of me. So yes, I am very concerned when adult ticks bite me. But if I'm vigilant like that, I usually pull them off within 24 hours. So I'm usually not too concerned about the disease transmission, but I will keep an eye on that.
Hi, Dr. Lee. We have quite a few questions from our Zoom viewers. The first one I think you already got at just now, which is it true that most of infections occur after a day's time feeding on the host? So if you get it off early, your risk from infection decreases.
Yes, so like I mentioned, especially with the pathogen that causes Lyme disease, it takes a while for it to migrate from the stomach into the mouth parts. So we generally say within 24 hours or so. But as I mentioned before, with the other pathogens, such as anaplasmosis, that time can be much shorter, within 12 hours or so. So it's important that you do your tick checks quickly and promptly remove the ticks. And something like Powassan virus that can be transmitted very quickly, that's another reason why you should do your tick checks while you're out in the field and not wait until you return home, to do it in the safety of your home.
Thank you. I have the question, do ticks have predators?
Ticks do have predators. Unfortunately, they're terrible predators. So instead of feeding on a tick, you have some other juicier things to feed on. And as you can see, they're really flat. There's not a lot of substance to them. But again, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of good information about that. We do know that there are predators out there. Ground beetles and spiders will eat them. It's a question of what proportion of the population is getting eaten by these predators, and what proportion is not being eaten by these predators. That we don't know. We do know that there are predators. It's just that maybe they're just not that tasty to those predators, and they may prefer to feed on other things outside of ticks.
Thank you. Patricia asks, how can we get the CDC to recognize chronic Lyme disease?
Yeah, so that's a tough question, because with something like chronic Lyme disease, you have to prove that there is an ongoing infection. And that's the problem with this, is that even if you do find the spirochetes inside of you, it's not a guarantee that it's a live infection. So, the spirochetes or the bacteria could be dead, could still be in you and not be doing anything. And a lot of your symptoms could be because of, the long-term effects of not being able to treat it earlier. And so it's really tricky, because we need to know that there is a live infection in order to call it something that is an ongoing infection.
Is there another name for the black-legged tick? I thought deer ticks carried Lyme.
Yeah. So I neglected to mention that, but the deer tick is a name. The black-legged tick is a name. And in some parts of Wisconsin, they even call it the bear tick. So all of those are just the same name to represent the same species, which is Ixodes scapularis. And there's a whole story behind why they have different names that if we have time, I may indulge you in, but it's a really fun story about a lot of eagle and how some people's eagles were destroyed within that time period. But yes, they all are referring to the same species.
Thank you. Can you get a tick if you stay in the middle of the trail?
Yeah, you definitely can stay in the, you can definitely get a tick if you stay in the middle of the trail, but that's also dependent on the makeup of that trail. So in a lot of the pictures I've shown you, the trails have vegetation or leaf litter on those trails, which also makes it a great habitat for ticks. If you are on a trail that's either dirt, 100% dirt, gravel, or something else like asphalt or concrete, your chances of coming into contact with a tick are much lower. They don't like that. It's dry, it's hot, not good habitat for deer ticks. So depending on the makeup of the trail, your risk can be very low. But if you are on a trail with a lot of debris, leaf litter, there is a chance there. So yes and no.
This question is, so if you have a tick bite, you don't automatically need antibiotics to combat Lyme disease and other diseases?
Yeah, so the recommendations right now are that if you have a tick bite that's within less than 24 hours, if you can visually see that the tick is not engorged, then you just sort of wait and see if you develop symptoms. But if that tick bite or that tick has been on you for greater than 24 hours, then it's recommended that you go in for that prophylactic treatment.
Thank you. Are there any effective natural ways to repel ticks?
It depends on where and how you want to sort of approach that. So for example, on us, on humans, you can use natural repellents, Deet. That's synthetic, but you can use repellents. Or if you are trying to keep ticks away from your environment. So for example, if you're a homeowner and you're trying to keep ticks away, there are other things that you can do. Landscape management, put a nice wood chip barrier. That's shown to be pretty effective at keeping ticks away from your lawn and from your house by creating a barrier. Reducing the amount of vegetation around your house, just plant some plants, leave a lot of space so that it's nice and open and sunny. I've driven around Madison and you can see homes with plants surrounding and engulfing pretty much the house, which makes it, which create great habitat for the rodents, which ticks love to feed on, and makes great habitat for ticks as well. So there are a lot of things that you can do to reduce exposure and tick bites. It's just a question of, are you sort of trying to prevent tick bites on you or preventing tick bites in general within your area?
Thank you. There's a person here who says, I hike and bike regularly. During an annual doctor's appointment, is there a lab that can identify Lyme and other diseases?
Yes, there are labs that can be run. Unfortunately, those labs are only effective if you have an ongoing infection. So if for example, if you get bitten by a tick and you go in right away, you may not develop antibodies fast enough, or you may not have antibodies for the test to pick it up. And even after being exposed and being bitten by a tick, you may still have antibodies, even though the infection has been cleared out of your system. So it's sort of not recommended to do that unless you know that you've gotten a tick bite within the last couple of days.
Are there any particular parts of the body that ticks are more likely to hang out, or any parts of the body that they avoid?
They seem to go everywhere they want, anywhere they want to. With nymphal ticks, like I said, they tend to quest at the lower height, so they will generally grab onto you around the ankle or around your calf. So that might be the spot for that life stage. With adult ticks, they tend to go all over the place because they do quest from the bottom all the way to about 4 or 5 feet. With that larva tick, I don't know how that got to my side. It's pretty small. They don't move really fast. They don't move very far. So chances are it probably was on my hand and somehow made its way into my body, into my side during the day. But in general, we don't have any recommendations or any thoughts on that because they seem to go wherever they want to. There's a sort of thought that they tend to like tight places around your waistline. If you're wearing a hat while you're out there around that. But I in all my years being out there and all the tick bites I've had, they always seem to be on my stomach.
There's a couple questions related to clothing. One of them is what you do with your clothing after you walk in the woods.
I am usually pretty careful about treating my pants with a permethrin, which is an acaricide. And so by treating my pants while I'm out there, if there are any ticks that grab onto me, they'll get a lethal dose of that acaricide or insecticide, and it will kill them before they can attach to me. But for the most part, when I get home, I usually just strip myself, throw my clothes into the wash, check myself for ticks, and then have my wife run that load. What you can do is you can take your clothes and throw it right into the dryer if you don't have them treated, and then just run it through one cycle, and that heat should be enough to kill the ticks. So you don't have to wash them, you just toss them in the dryer.
And then the second question about clothing was, what do you think of insect shield clothing that's pre-treated with pyrethrin? I might not be saying that right.
Permethrin? Yeah, so we, for our group, we highly recommend it because as I mentioned before, it is an insecticide or a caricide. And so when you're out there and your clothes are treated with that, if there is a tick that gets on you, it'll get that lethal dose of that insecticide and it'll kill them before they can attach to you. Or if they do attach to you, they'll die pretty quickly. So the risk of being exposed to a tick-borne pathogen are pretty low in that case. So we do highly recommend it. You can purchase clothes that are already pre-treated. Those tend to be a lot more expensive. Or you can just go out to Walmart or Menards or Home Depot and purchase a bottle of permethrin that's specifically made for you to treat your clothing. And that's a lot more cost-effective way of doing it.
Thank you. And the follow-up to that was, is Deet as good if you spray it on your clothing?
Yes, Deet is very good, very effective, but it has to be greater than 40% Deet. So if you use sort of the family addition of Deet, which is like 15% or something like that, yes, it will repel ticks, but it's not as effective as 40% Deet.
Great, thank you. Please clarify the disease transmission from nymphs versus adults.
Yeah, so nymphs can transmit disease. We generally think that they are responsible for a lot of the disease transmission because they are smaller, harder to detect. Their activity pattern lines up very well with our activity patterns of being outside. Adults are also responsible for disease transmission, although we don't see a spike at during the fall and during the spring when adults are active. And we generally think that because they are easier to spot. One thing about the transmission there is that because nymphs are they've only had one blood meal as a larva, the chances of them having a pathogen are much lower compared to an adult tick that's had 2 blood meals. So we generally say that your risk is double with the adult ticks.
A few more here. Will a tick be larger and full of blood before it secretes its bacterium?
No, the issue here is that we have general guidelines on what a tick should look like after 24 hours of feeding on you, 36 hours and so forth, but that can change, depending on the tick. So yes, it may look a little bit engorged after 24 hours, but it's not going to be so much, it's not going to be so engorged that you're going to look at it and say, hey, this is a very well engorged tick. A very well engorged tick, not pictured here, will look like a grape on you. And so a 24-hour engorged tick looks almost like a flat tick, maybe a little bit expanded.
Oh, thank you. The next question, the viewer is referring to a show she saw about the author Amy Tan, who indicated that many years after a tick bite, she was exhibiting some strange behavior, such as driving through red lights, and she was diagnosed with Lyme disease. So the question is, if we don't have symptoms for a specific number of years, 5, 10, are we safe?
Yeah, in general, it's hard to attribute something like that because it's been so long unless they can, prove that it's an ongoing infection. I haven't seen that by Amy Tan, so I can't say for sure. But what we generally say is that if we can prove that there's an ongoing infection, then yes, but because it could be a variety of other things, it's so hard to tell. Like, one of the long-term symptoms of Lyme disease is arthritis, and you can get arthritis from a wide variety of things as well. So it's hard to tell, and I don't dispute her on that. But for us, unless we see a live infection, it's really hard for us to make that call.
Are some people more predisposed to tick-borne infections than others?
Yes, and again, that also depends on things such as your health condition, right? If you're immunocompromised, your chances of developing severe Lyme disease, or sorry, not severe Lyme disease, but severe tick-borne diseases is much higher compared to a healthy individual. But then of course there's also the question of, are there some people who are more predisposed to being bitten by a tick and that is sort of still up for grabs. We know that with mosquitoes, there are some individuals that are more attracted that the mosquitoes are attracted to. And there are some food choices that seem to attract mosquitoes. We did some work some years ago to suggest that maybe bananas, if you eat banana before you go outside, might make you a little bit more attractive to mosquitoes. And so it could be the same thing for ticks. We just don't have enough research to support that.
Got it. Thank you. A good way to close might be to just address a couple questions that came through about repeating the website and the app information you showed at the end of the presentation. The specific name of the Tick app, and is there a website URL that you are recommending?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that that I showed there. I can definitely send a separate document with everything that I put on the slide, so that you guys can so that anybody can access those, the tick identification service, or access the Tick app, or the Tick bot from CDC, along with other things such as the Tick tracker. So I can definitely provide that to Laura. Yes.
Thank you so much for answering all those questions.
Yeah, you're welcome.